Thank you for being here for tonight's program. I love the energy already. That's a good fit for tonight's program. My name is James Kenley, the Executive Director for the Vail Symposium. Tonight is my first official event in that role, so I'm so grateful to see you all here. Thank you. On behalf of our board chair, Dale Mosier, there we go, and our whole board, we really appreciate you being here. Welcome. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, thought-provoking, and diverse programming to the Vail community since 1971. I'd like to thank the organizations and individuals who make the Vail Symposium programs possible. Bear with me, it's a little bit of a list. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. The Hot Topics series, which is what we're in tonight, is underwritten by Kathy and Neil Kimmel. Tonight's program is underwritten by Wendy Rudolph and Graham Bush. Tickets cover less than 15% of our operating revenue. So we really depend on donors at every level to make this possible. Thank you. Before I turn the stage over to our esteemed presenter this evening, I'd like to extend an invitation to you to join us immediately after this program for a brief celebration of our retiring executive director, Chris Sable. I'm honored to be passed the baton following his 6 years of leadership. I'm grateful to call him a friend and a mentor. I'll ask you for one more round of applause in his honor. And Chris, wherever you are, could you please stand up? He's upstairs. So we can't see him, but he can see us. Tonight, we have a very special program with Erik Peterson entitled Envisioning the World of 2023. Mr. Peterson has been in the business of examining macro trends for more than 3 decades, starting at Kissinger Associates, continuing at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and now at Carney's Global Business Policy Council. Tonight will be a fast-paced, cross-sector examination of our world and an opportunity to consider what the near future may hold in store for all of us. Please welcome to the Vail Symposium for the first time, Erik Peterson.
James, thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm so very delighted to be here tonight. And what I'd like to do is to talk to you not only about the immediate future, how the world might continue to evolve over the next 12 months, but also to look deep, to look long, and to ask the question, what are the core trends shaping the outlook for our families, for our communities, and for our states, provinces, and countries? I think that we are moving into, as we go forward, we're moving into terra incognita. We're moving into unknown territory for a number of reasons that I would like to share with you. Now, when we think about the whole issue of all of the drivers of change that are shaping the environment going forward, we have to begin by acknowledging that we're not alone. In fact, 5,290 miles away from here, and I looked it up, in 5 days' time, a number of people are going to be wringing their hands about cooperation in a fragmented world in another little village. Perhaps it will have the same degree of snow that we have here in beautiful Vail. But I wanted to tell you that I think that our opportunity tonight, not only are we beating them in timing, but you are beating them in altitude. In fact, it's not even close. 8,150 versus a mere 5,118. Congratulations. Now, I've been to the Davos Theater more than a couple times. I don't know if any of you are planning on going as well. It's an extraordinary opportunity to meet remarkable people from all over the world. But in the end, I think that all of us need to be thinking about ways to get beyond the short term, to get beyond the headlines, and to be thinking about the core drivers of change shaping where we're going. And to that end, the Forum puts out every year a thing that it calls the Global Risks Report. This one was issued about 5 hours ago. And they begin with two overarching conclusions. The first is not exactly rocket science, that we're seeing the return of a number of risks that we've seen before. Inflation, many of us here lived through inflation in the 1970s. Trade wars, capital outflows, and the specter of nuclear warfare. But they also said that these are being amplified by new developments, which I would argue are familiar issues as well. Debt, sovereign debt issues around the world, low growth, investment, deglobalization, a decline in human development, development of dual-use technologies, and climate change are on their list. Well, if this is an architecture for how those delegates in Davos are going to be thinking from the 16th on, well, then they are going to have their hands full, and we can wish them well. I wonder, when we think about the whole issue of strategic foresight and the degree to which it exists in Davos among all of the government and the private sector and NGO leaders who congregate there, I wonder how they would have reacted in 2015, only a few years ago, if you had argued, I believe that the world is going to be beset by a pandemic that will affect countries the planet over. On top of that, this pandemic is going to bring economies across the globe to a standstill. Add to that the resurgence of inflation, which virtually didn't exist at the time, as you'll recall. Then a major land war in Europe. And then finally, the second largest economy in the world that in effect would turn its economy off with a zero COVID set of policies, and then restart it abruptly afterwards. I would argue that if you would have suggested these points in 2015 in Davos, they would have thrown you out of the Congress Center there on your ear. But here we are, and I think that there are two overarching conclusions that I believe will resonate across the comments that I'm here to offer to you tonight. The first is that looking for the current challenges, the tip of your nose issues, is simply not enough. I mean, to be sure, there is the urgent and the immediate, but we need to be looking well beyond that. We need to be thinking in longer range terms. And then beyond that, leaders, no matter where they are, no matter what they do, no matter what impact they want to have, to forge strategic partnerships, maximize organizational efficiency and resilience, they have to look long. And here is where I think 2023 is critical for us to be sure, but we need to be looking beyond that. So tonight, in the same spirit of my hypothetical 2015 Davos points, I'm here to offer you what I think will shape 2023 and beyond. First is that this terra incognita into which we're moving, the first dimension is a period of what we can call unstable geopolitical multipolarity. That sounds like a political science course type description. But in effect, we're looking at a world in which we see significant diffusion of power right now with profound implications longer range. Add to that new demographic realities. I know that you heard from a demographer in January, but I will either pile on or contradict, but I certainly have a few ideas that I'd like to share with you. Now, the people in Davos are going to be worried about a world of fragmentation, and economic fragmentation, I believe, is something that you and I need to take very seriously indeed. And then we need to be looking at the slowing growth identified by the Global Risk Report. Add to that the global environmental stress that we're seeing day by day now. We're looking at Philippines or California or a variety of other areas in the world. And then finally, governments. Governments are really embattled the planet over. And I believe that this whole notion of governments struggling to cope with circumstances that may seem beyond their capacity to control is something that you and I need to factor in our thinking about the long range. So with that by way of background then, let's talk shop. We'll move into the geopolitical multipolarity that I talked about. Here are the headline issues that I think that we can use to frame our thinking. Major powers now across the world are at simultaneous national inflection points. Unbelievable, all of them at the same time. There is an incredible shifting military balance that has been obscured by all of the global economic integration that's happened, as critical as it is. We had 4 great powers. It expanded to 6, it's going back down to 4, and then to 2. And how those powers interact with one another in the context of this multipolarity will tell the tale of where things are going. And then finally, I'll leave this as a tantalizing conclusion here. The jungle grows back. I don't know if any of you have ever encountered Robert Kagan, the brilliant analyst from Brookings Institution in Washington. But Kagan has written a book that I think captures precisely where we are and where we're going. So where do things stand in 2023 and beyond? Well, we have to begin by stipulating, you and I, that hegemony is back with a vengeance. The bottom line is that if international organizations and rules, non-aggression issues, non-acquisition of territory by force used to mean something in the world, it means a lot less after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Add to that the whole notion about the UN system more generally eroding in a number of the specialized functions that were determined for it. Functions that run the gamut from the IAEA to the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization that we saw stressed by the whole COVID chapter. Across the board now, we're seeing that organization stressed. And then we're seeing the possibility for new levels of aggression elsewhere in the world. All of us here, I think, are wondering about China and Taiwan, or the possibility of conflict in the South China Sea, or traditional conflicts, Middle East and Korean Peninsula and elsewhere coming to be. This has suddenly become very, very significant yet again. Now, in my view, the framework that will begin to answer these questions, as I mentioned earlier, the next 10 years and more will be defined by 6 major geopolitical powers. 4 are the ones that you and I have known from the very beginnings of our lives. That is the US and the Soviet Union, the players in the Cold War, Europe, which played such a critical role after Reconstruction post-World War II, and Japan, same thing. And now we have to be adding to that, of course, the Soviet Union has shifted to Russia, but to those 4 we need to be adding China, which has had this meteoric economic and political rise, especially in the last 40 years, and then India, which I think is the big riser going forward. So we're talking about India and China, and we're now talking about multipolarity in the truest sense of the word. I told my son that I was going to draw a comparison with Game of Thrones in terms of competing power centers. And he shook his head and said, "Oh, Dad, those poor people." But that's really what I believe to be true, that we're going to be seeing more equal competition in a number of other areas, and I'll tell you why. Now, the first point here that I wanted to raise are these simultaneous national inflection points. Is there anyone here who would argue that the U.S. is not at an inflection point right now? We are certainly, as a representative of Washington, D.C., where you can't take friendship personally these days, I can assure you that political alliances and allegiances are very fleeting indeed. And I would argue that the political and social divisions go far beyond the Beltway. Perhaps they're even in this room. And in the end, to me, it's striking that it's getting more and more difficult for us to be thinking about what the U.S. stands for and what the U.S. stands for in the world in which it is situated. And I would argue that our propensity to move to things ever shorter term is pulling the longer range strategic carpet from underneath our feet. And the upshot here is that leaders, no matter what they believe, are failing the test of thinking how to be positioning the country for what will be a turbulent period ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, where are the strategic thinkers? James, in his gracious introduction, mentioned that I had worked with Kissinger over the years. I also had the opportunity to work with Zbig Brzezinski, who was a big supporter of the whole notion of grand strategy, a big strategy where you try to see how the parts fit together. Who's thinking in those terms right now? I really wonder. Well, if that's the maladie that we can say applies to the U.S., Europe is in a much better position. It's had the historical challenge of trying to come up with some kind of broader vision that could be commonly held across diverse units in the EU and other areas. I thought this was underlined when Emmanuel Macron came up last summer with the whole notion of a European political community. Now, the idea was to get a short-term vehicle to get Ukraine and other groups involved without having them join the EU. But to me, it just underlined the complexities and even perhaps the uncertainties with respect to what being a member of the EU or the broader security alliances that exist in Europe really does mean. Where will that go post-Ukraine? I don't think anyone is in a position to weigh in on that question with any degree of certainty. In Japan, those of you who watch Japan know that they are at a critical inflection point in terms of redefining their military position in the region and in the world. This is a big deal, and this represents a very significant shift after the self-accepted limitations after the Second World War that they put into place. In the end now, we're thinking about a range of contingencies across the region which would require a much more robust, a more muscular military position for Japan. Add to that, we were talking about Japan. We go next to Russia. What an epic strategic miscalculation Mr. Putin is on right now with Ukraine. No matter how you do the math right now, in terms of military, economics, a range of other factors, he's in serious trouble. And that country and its prospects are limited by definition, and I'll come back to that momentarily. But they're even more limited as a result of the Ukraine adventure that he's on. The declining strategic footprint applies to the former near abroad of the Soviet Union, the contiguous countries to what Russia is, its gigantic landmass of 1/6 of the earth. And on top of that, we need to be thinking about cohesion, the trajectory of the economy, a range of other factors, all of which suggest a diminution longer range. And then finally, before we get to India, there's China. What a remarkable shift of policy that we've seen, zero COVID, and then moving over to kind of COVID-free these days. But in effect, we can expect to see now that Xi Jinping has consolidated his already very strong position with the Party Congress last October. The operative question then is, what does China hope to achieve in the world? Now, I mentioned that as we think about this, China is the big rise, but also India goes on that list. By any measure, we believe that India is rising extremely rapidly right now, especially with respect to economy. It was the fastest growing major economy pre-COVID. It certainly is now. And it's a beneficiary of some of the shifting or the decoupling of commercial operations that we are seeing from China. All six at the same time in fundamental ways. Now, on top of that, we need to be thinking about shifts in military balance. How many of you were aware that China has the largest navy in the world? That's a surprise to many people that I encounter. It has 340 hulls going up to about 400 by the year 2025. And it's launching state-of-the-art aircraft carriers right now for a more significant military position, an order of battle position in the South China Sea, to be sure, but to project power worldwide. Now, what about fighter aircraft? Behind me, you see a J-20 stealth aircraft, and it is only, China is one of two countries in the world, the US the other one, that has these stealth aircraft. And it already has squadrons positioned in Asia. It is the biggest in the region, third largest in the world in terms of 2,250 combat aircraft. This is tremendously significant in terms of conventional military capabilities. But then when you add to that some of the issues in terms of this changing military balance that our own Pentagon has emphasized, including in a report that was issued a couple months ago called the Pentagon Military Power Report to Congress, it shows that China is moving on to possess 1,500 nuclear weapons within the next decade. And if you look at least at the formal statements that are coming out of Beijing, you can see by the time of the 100-year anniversary of the Liberation Army, 2027, they have wanted to modernize military capabilities across the board. And then the big one is 2049, when the goal for China, and I quote, is to lead the world in terms of composite national strength and international influence. This really is a remarkable rise that we're seeing right now. Now, when we think about that rise in the broader geopolitical multipolarity, here are two interesting measures that we can use. These are our economic projections looking at each of these six economies going out to the year 2030. They're expressed as a percentage of total global economy in this chart. And the results are pretty significant. You can see the US with a marginal decline. That is when the overall economy is rising. That's probably not too surprising. China has a very significant rate of increase, but will not for the foreseeable future, I believe, and this goes against perhaps what other people have mentioned in this forum and what others are arguing in articles. We do not see the US surpassing China in terms of PPP, purchasing power parity denominated output anytime soon in the near future and for the foreseeable future. We see the EU on the same kind of decline here as we see the US. India is a rapid ascent right now, but still has a very small percentage of global economy. And then there are two countries economically that are fading rapidly right now: Japan and most significantly, Russia. Ergo 6, ergo 4, ergo 2, that I'll come back to momentarily. Now, the population outlook, and this one goes out to the year 2050, more or less tells the same story. We see China rising in the short term, but then dropping very significantly, in part because of the residual effects of its one-child policy. And this year, 2023, will mark the point at which India surpasses China as the most populous country in the world. EU is on sharp decline in green here. And then again, Japan and Russia are in effect, they don't even show up. They're rounding error territory here. 2.5%, something along those lines. So what we're seeing now is a significant shift that will create what I mentioned earlier. The jungle grows back. If you have a little time, it's not a long book, please order it, from Kagan, America and Our Imperiled World. And the thesis of this book is that we have nation states bound by treaties, and we have a period of remarkable economic and political stability through which you and I have lived. And now he argues that in effect is loosening, that the jungle is growing back, and that period of US-driven peace across the world was what he calls a great historical aberration, and that we're beginning to see this Game of Thrones world begin to come back as the jungle grows back. Geopolitical multipolarity. Now, what are the issues in terms of a demographic story? You've already heard on this, I'll go through it relatively quickly, but what we've got on the horizon is a population downshift that will affect your life, the lives of your children, and certainly your grandchildren in the future. There's a remarkable big schism in the world between countries that will be engaging in depopulation, some of them very rapidly, and some on hyperpopulation. Add to that an aging overhang, and then finally there is a shifting global population balance that we need to take into account. I've just mentioned some of it in the context of multipolarity. So let me run through these things. It was November 15, not very long ago, and this baby, Damien, was born in the Dominican Republic. And he was, at least according to the United Nations, the 8 billionth human being to be in the current population of our world. The fact of the matter is that our population is now increasing at the rate of about 66.9 million per year. That translates into 183,000 and change per day, 7,600 per hour, 127 per minute, and 1 every 2.1 seconds. 1,001, 1,002, there goes another one. That's where we are right now. And if you look at the trajectory of global population growth, and we've all seen this, I think, over the course of our lifetime, when we look at pre-Damien and post-Damien, we see two very different stories. The pre-Damien was very significant. Imagine, it took all of human history to get to 1 billion people by the year 1804. We reached 2 billion by 1927. 1959 was the time we reached 3. 74 was 4 billion. 87, 5, 99, 6. 2011, 7. And then Damien arrived a few weeks ago. Now, if that's where we've been, then where are we going? Well, we probably will reach the 9 billion mark in 2037, at least according to the most recent projections. 10 billion by the year 2058, and this is far, far earlier than many people had projected. We can look at a peak population level, we think now, at 2084 at about 10.43 billion. Now, many of you, like I did, I presume, grew up in the shadow of Ehrlich's population bomb and some projections, Club of Rome, limits to growth, of remarkably higher populations than this. This is still a significant population load, but in terms of carrying capacity for the planet and a range of other issues, this is good news from what we knew earlier. In effect, we are seeing a changing rate of growth that should help taper some of the pressures that we see. And in the end, the reason for this is an amazing historical X through which you and I are now living. So we see the population growth going south to north, but if we look at rate of growth, it's an amazing story of north to south. People are no longer having as many children as they had before. And our rate of growth is, in effect, slamming on the demographic brakes. In 2020, the population growth fell for the first time since 1950 to under 1%. And if we continue moving this way, by 2086, about the time that we see that peak inflation, we could see 0% growth going forward. Really, really remarkable. And what that does is it changes, here's the regression, but in effect that strong red line should be the core message that you take from this key point about the population downshift. We're moving from explosion to implosion. Well, what does this mean practically? It means that you and I will be dealing with a world of high growth on the one hand, low growth on the other, the net of which is creating this downshift. Here is the high side. The fact of the matter is the least developed countries in the world many are expected to double their populations between 2020 and 2050. Nigeria, Congo, Tanzania, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Angola, Niger, Egypt, US, and Sudan. And then on the depopulation side, some 27 countries since 2010 have seen a reduction in the size of their population of more than 1%. And many more are following, as you can see here. And they're not necessarily the ones that you and I would expect to see. Would you have expected to see China at the top of this list, for example? It could see between 2020 and the end of the century, by current projections, a decline of some 374 million. And you can see the list here, Japan, Brazil, Thailand, etc., going forward. The global aging story will be the story of economic developments, of commercial trajectories, of broader strategic issues. The aging overhang in much of the developed world will be the critical factor in terms of defining where things are going. By 2050, globally, the number of persons over the age of 65 projected to be more than twice the number of children under age 5. We've never seen age dependency ratios like this before. And what it means in practical terms is that we will see some countries that can fit, at least according to Moody's, in what they call the super aging category. By 2030, it could go up to 34 countries, South Korea, Switzerland, UK, and the US. And if you look at it in terms of broader impact on global growth, it could shave off an entire percentage point of global growth as a result of diversion of resources to older age segments. Here's what I'm talking about. This is a standard global profile by age cohort from the year 1950. Men are on the left in green, women are on the right in the kind of tan, and it's organized by 0 to 4 years on the left here, all the way up to the centenarians, those who managed to stick it out beyond 100 years. Watch, would you please, as we begin to see one of the most significant transformations of our world take place. 1950 goes to 1975. Then to 2000, and we're beginning to see more by way of population. It's on the top of the population pyramid. Here it begins to rise even more significantly, especially on the female side, by 2025, where we are now. 2050, you can see now what used to be a world age pyramid is now more nearly becoming a world age rectangle. And sure enough, in 2075, latest projections, we see that phenomenon. And then finally, by the end of the century, we're even beginning to see the signs of an inverted pyramid. This changes a number of things, not least of which are the underlying economics and the broader social makeup of countries across the world. Now, this has been quite heavy, and I wanted to share with you a film from Denmark, which is a country experiencing this rapid population decompression. And this is a television commercial that aired there way back when, in 2014, from a travel company that was trying to, in one way or another, get Danes to take their travel vacations on the guise of this whole global aging phenomenon. So here, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll forgive me, it's tough to read the specific translation, so I'll do it as we go. But here is the TV commercial entitled "Do It for Denmark." Can sex save Denmark's future? Denmark faces a problem. The birth rate is at a 27-year low, and there are not enough children being born to support the aging population. The Danish government has not found a solution, but there has to be one. Here is Emma. She is Danish, and even though she was born and raised in Denmark, she was conceived in Paris, right up there in that hotel room. 30 years ago, Emma's parents took a little journey. If these walls could talk. But it turns out Emma's case isn't so rare. 10% of all Danish children are conceived on holidays to travel and get new experiences affecting relationships because couples see each other in a new light. It releases endorphins in the brain and creates the desire for sex. It's how we get children. In fact, and this is subtle, Danes have 46% more sex on vacation. So to help the falling Danish rate, our travel company wants to encourage all Danes to take a romantic city holiday. After all, it will also help our future business. But if doing it for Denmark isn't motivation enough, we made a little competition. Book your holiday with our ovulation certificate. Get it on and prove that you managed to get a pregnancy and win a 3-year supply and a child holiday. But what if you already did your duty? Or what if your chances of conceiving a child isn't so good? Well, look at it this way. It's not just about the winning. All the fun is in participation. So at least somebody's looking at this depopulation with a great sense of humor. Go Denmark, ladies and gentlemen. So now, where is this all taking us? In the year 2000, China, as you know, was at the top of the world population list with 1.26 billion, followed by India, US, and the other countries here. By 2025, India, as I've mentioned, will have surpassed China and will stand at 1.45. The others are more or less the same, except look at the rise of Nigeria, which goes from 120 million to 230 million. Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo are on the list. In 2030, we see that the US maintains its third place position, but not for long. Ethiopia and Democratic Republic of Congo are still on the list there. And now have a close look at this, would you please? Projected by year 2100, we're talking about India twice as large, more or less, as China. Isn't that staggering? Followed by Nigeria, 550 million, Pakistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, then US, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Brazil, Bangladesh. This is a same demographic planet, a different world, different population world that we are facing a longer range. All right, so we've talked about the multipolarity. We've talked about the whole demographics. A few words on the economic fragmentation that the Davos delegates will be talking about when they meet next week. We have a highly uncertain economic outlook, short-term and longer range. The prospects for what I called islandization versus globalization in year 2014, I think are more palpable by the day. We have an uneven economic recovery in front of us. And finally, again, we see a shifting global economic balance in the longer term. Now, if you look at what the World Bank and the IMF are saying, more or less it was the same. Both organizations were expecting a much better year for 22 than we got. Why did they have to downgrade their projections? The answer is obvious. We had continuing dislocations that came from COVID. We had the remarkable Russian invasion of Ukraine, which had reverberations in a number of key areas. And there were a number of other issues with respect to financial, broader macroeconomic issues that could not be worked through very, very rapidly. Now, these are my projections, but they're very close to both the World Bank and the IMF. We think that probably we saw output of about 2.9% in 2022. We're still estimating now, which is a drop from the big post-COVID increase that we had of 6.1% in the year 2021. And we're projecting that this year, 2023, we're projecting 1.3% as a result of continued geopolitical problems, as well as the very significant and aggressive policies undertaken by central banks across the world. Now, we've done scenario analysis by unpacking and adding econometric forecasting to this. And we believe that looking out to the end of the decade, that probably, just probably, we'll see a recovery in the 2025 timeframe, peaking in 26, and then more or less flattening out and declining a bit through the end of the decade. There are a number of core variables here that we can account for in the scenario thinking, not least of which is what might happen between the US and China with respect to economics. And I spend a lot of my time doing modeling on that these days. So if we look at the report that we issued in 2014 from globalization to islandization, it really would have been interesting to roll this out. We did distribute it in Davos, but at the time, we did not have a very receptive audience. We wrote then that as the world steps back from globalization, the rules of the road have become more complicated, lower growth, return of geopolitics, leading to a resurgence of nationalism going forward. Too bad we didn't think that through earlier on at 2014. What are these islandization issues? If you read the Financial Times, you ought to read every word written by Martin Wolf, I believe. He's one of the most brilliant people I've ever encountered. He's written a book on globalization, quite literally. And he argued very early on the pandemic in May 21 that in effect we were seeing a second globalization under threat. The second globalization is what has framed our success, our vitality, our economic dynamism over the course of our lifetimes. And then Hank Paulson has also argued that allowing an economic iron curtain to descend would imperil the recovery and jeopardize economic and social stability. That rings true every bit as much today as it did when he rang the alarm bell in April 21. At Davos, Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, is going to say yet again, and she's been saying this for a while, that our ability to respond to the economic challenges that we face right now is hampered by another consequence of the war in Ukraine, the sharply increased risk of geoeconomic fragmentation. And she has that absolutely right, in my view. So if we look forward then, where is the growth going to be? And I talked about a revival, some degree of recovery in 24, 25, 26 range. We think that it will be an Asia story. And our projections suggest that Vietnam, India, Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, China are all at the top of the list when we think about that period, the 23-25 period. And we think that the Asia region will account for highest economic vitality of the decade. U.S. should be, there's so many variables at work right now. We're anticipating 1.1% this year, going up also to the high ones, maybe even the twos, by the time we get to 2026. India, as I've already mentioned already, is the big success story that we need to be watching. The fact is that a decade ago, India's GDP was 11th. It could be the third largest national economy in the world by the end of the decade. Now remember, it has a huge amount of catching up to do with China and the US. Remember, I mentioned that they were still way down in the rankings. But nevertheless, the IMF and our own data certainly suggest that it has a huge future in front of it. Environmental pressures. So I don't think that this would have to go very far in terms of California right now, in terms of the issues that they're facing down. But we see an acceleration of degradation, mounting effects of climate change in particular, economic impact, and then finally impact on key resources. I put a video of the sea up. I don't know if you read today's articles about this being the 5th year of consecutive rise in sea temperatures. But it's only the latest of the data which seem to suggest how difficult things are going to be. Now, as we think about the connection between this and the population trends that I talked about, the obvious question is carrying capacity. And according to the UN, the global material footprint rose from 43 billion metric tons in 1990 to some 54 by the turn of the century, and to 92 billion by 2017, the last year for which data are possible. And they look at the rate of natural resource extraction has accelerated and now projected to grow even more significant despite a potential downturn in the economy, at least for the next year or two. The data, the empirical data underpinning temperature anomalies continues to persist. I won't drive home the point except to say that these very significant extreme weather events that we're seeing now are only part of the outcome. If we look at global land and ocean anomalies, this really does tell the story. This is from NOAA, National Centers for Environmental Information. It's one of many that kind of fit in this category. We watch the bottom line with respect to what it will affect the economy. And we already see, and we're interested to see, friends of ours at Oxford Economics predicting warming exceeding 2 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels by 2050 would generate a number of big opportunity cost declines in output growth for China, EU, India, Russia, US, and world. Really, this should be framing our thinking about where things are going right now. What I'm focused on personally is thinking about what this will mean for food, water, and energy. And as we start with energy here, if you look at what the International Energy Agencies is arguing, that the situation has become all the more difficult as a result of the Russian invasion. And the IEA notes that there are huge uncertainties about how this energy crisis is going to play itself out. A great set of articles from the IMF on the European conundrum right now that have just come out. And to look at the relation between energy disruption and geopolitical fragmentation that will be the discussion at Davos. If we look at agriculture, the Food and Agriculture Organization notes that producing 70% more food for an additional 2.3 billion people is a very significant challenge without ratcheting up levels of hunger. And Nature magazine argues with empirical backing that soil erosion is a major threat. National Geographic says the world lost 502,000 square miles of forest between 1990 and 2016. And we need to be deploying, I would argue now, the remarkable new technologies that are beginning to come online, precision farming and a range of other factors that are really changing levels of efficiency. Same applies to water. Agriculture accounts for 70% of global water use. To the extent that we can address agricultural use of water, we will be a whole world, better world off. Shrinking water bodies from lakes to aquifers to rivers across the world, 129 conflicts involving water between 2011 and 2017 alone. OECD is doing work now looking at water stress and believes that some 4 billion people will be under stress in the next few years. Again, technologies really do pose some significant hope in this area that we can begin to turn this around. So now, this brings me to embattled governments, what I call rising ungovernability. And here we have a loss or end of public trust, an acceleration of de-democratization, an erosion of international institutions, and the new social channels that we all hear about virtually every day. Are any of you familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer? A great report that looks at popular attitudes across 28 countries, some 36,000 respondents. And they roll it out every Davos. So stay tuned. Next week, the 2023 version is going to be coming out. But 2022 said enough in my book. The main conclusion was that distrust across the world, 28 countries, is now society's default emotion. 2/3 of respondents were inclined to distrust organizations. 60% distrust something until they see otherwise. And some 2/3 say that they're at a point where they're incapable of having constructive conversations on key issues. That's where things stood. And I have no doubt that we'll have even more when it rolls out next week. Now, what I thought you might be interested in seeing is that as far as the 28 countries, the 36,000 respondents, they believed that to coordinate cross-institutional efforts to solve the big problems, to take a leadership role, business was in first place, followed by NGOs, media, and government dead last. To get results, to successfully execute plans and strategies that yield results, business, NGOs, media, and government dead last. This has been a persistent pattern over the years, but in the end, we need to be thinking about ways to revivify public policy in terms of where we're going. Do any of you know this word? Kakistocracy. Kakistocracy. Have any of you heard this before? This is a great word. Make sure you commit it to memory for the next cocktail party you're at. What you can do is sigh and say, yeah, that's the result of a kakistocracy. Why would you say that? Kakistocracy is a government by the least suitable or competent citizens of a state. Was that worth the price of admission tonight, ladies and gentlemen? A state or society governed by its least suitable or competent citizens. Now, fortunately, we're not in that case, but there are a number of countries across the world now. Think what's going on in Brazil, certainly Peru. There are a number of other areas. We're watching the terrible distress developments in Iran. Afghanistan, to be sure. There are a number of these issues across the world. But we need to be thinking about the whole notion of kakistocracy. My former employer, Henry Kissinger, wrote early. He's 99 years old now. I think he'll be reaching 100 sometime soon. I think in August. He wrote early in the pandemic in the Wall Street Journal, nations cohere and flourish on the belief that their institutions can foresee calamity, arrest its impact, and restore stability. And then he argued that when COVID is over, many countries will be perceived as having failed. Whether that judgment is right is irrelevant, he writes. The reality is the world will never be the same after the coronavirus in the shift of this geopolitical structure that I've been mentioning. I think he has this one right on the button. And if we look now in terms of systems of government, I think Freedom in the World, which is a well-respected annual report issued by Freedom House, it's a bipartisan group, has argued that the present threat to democracy is the product of 16 consecutive years of decline in terms of their global tracking. A total of 60 countries suffered declines over the past year, while only 25 improved. Getting harder and harder, especially in this information environment, for democracies not to devolve into kakistocracies. This is a photograph that I took in Paris a couple of years ago. I was tear gassed on the way to a museum, minding my own business, when the Gilets jaunes, the protesters, were roaming the streets and the police were trying to beat them back, and somehow I got caught in the middle. But I took a picture of this window. It says, fin de moi, that's end of me, début de nous, start of us. But the operative question is, who is us? Who is us? And how are we going to be reorganizing in the future? And I think that in the end, that movement lost momentum precisely because they couldn't answer that question. I did it again, I'm sorry, I got fired up on that one. So that takes me to what the UN Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, said to the General Assembly last September. A winter of global discontent, he argues, is on the horizon. Trust is crumbling, inequality is getting wider, planet is certainly going through a difficult time, people are hurting, with the most vulnerable suffering the most. And then, operative language here, the UN Charter and the ideals it represents are in jeopardy. Now is the time precisely for that strategic thinking, the need for which I emphasized in the beginning of my comments. And I think if there is a frank point of view that we've seen here, this one from the UN Secretary General is it. And in order to get to that kind of strategic thinking, that kind of grand strategy that Brzezinski advocated, we need somehow to get behind bumper sticker sloganeering and TikToking. Somehow we need to be getting into more trustful, more respectful discourse on a whole range of other issues, and then to push our short-term issues, no matter how immediate they are, into thinking about the longer range. So with this, I hope that you see why I think that these would be the right ones to raise in Davos next week, and that I have raised, I've had the privilege of raising before you tonight. Multipolarity in the geopolitical sense, new demography, economic fragmentation, continued environmental global stress, and then governments that are struggling to cope. These are the issues that I think present both challenges, to be sure, but opportunities for the strategic thinkers among us, the entrepreneurial types, who can navigate in this kind of complex environment. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I'd like to thank you in multiple languages. And now to James, who will preside over a question and answer period.
The Vail Symposium, introducing new dinner party vocabulary since 1971. Kakistocracy is a winner. Thanks, Eric. That really was phenomenal. That's all I've got. Who would like to get us started? Mr. Dobbs.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for cheering us up. The strategic thinking you hope will occur, is that going to be worth the paper it's recorded on if the deep and destructive divisions, not just in this country, as we saw last weekend in Brazil, we see in Israel, we would see more of in China and Russia if people were permitted to speak their mind. Is it going to be worth anything if those only grow?
I choose to think it will. I'm not sure that strategic thinking exists in any of the forums that you just mentioned. But in the end, if there's a way for us to begin to encourage and promote authentic strategic thinking and empirically based consideration of the various forces of work around the world or within our national boundaries or whatever it may happen to be, that is a step in the right direction, I think. But now I have to tell you that I don't see a lot of it. I have the opportunity to go up every year to Syracuse University, Maxwell School. It's a group of very senior Pentagon officials that meet there, and I think that there are probably more than a few intelligence people in the audience as well. It's a remarkable group. And I love to taunt them by asking, who would you identify as a critical, living, authentically strategic thinker that you think could help navigate through these rapids? And they have trouble doing it. And oftentimes, government officials will point to private sector folks. They'll point to a Bill Gates or to years ago, Elon Musk, before pre-Twitter Musk. To me, that was quite remarkable. A lot of them stuck with leaders who were no longer with us on this planet. And to me, that was emblematic, very emblematic, year after year, of why we need to be thinking in more innovative terms about how we can create the next generation of strategic thinkers. Maybe a group like this could begin to pull it together.
Thank you very much. With the population modeling that you projected and the global environmental concerns, drought, lack of water, how do we think that these African nations and these third world countries are going to be able to grow and sustain?
We shouldn't. And not only that, it will translate into large-scale migration in terms of environmental issues on the one hand and then resource dislocations on the other. If I had to point to one area that I thought was most serious in the list that I highlighted here tonight, that would be it.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for all this hard work, your demographic and statistical work. It's amazing. I just want to ask you about your demographic work. Sorry. As populations develop, often you see something called the demographic transition, which means women decide to have less children because they can. So I think your modeling in 2100 is more on a straight line trajectory without bringing into account if you do have development in Africa, for example, where economies are less dependent on subsistence agriculture, you will see a profound change in women's and family behavior, which leads to lower birth rates. So I just wanted to add that. It's not a straight line.
And look, we began to see this great decline, the slamming on the demographic brakes, when even in the developing world, when before women had the capacity to choose, in effect, how many children they had. We saw it because, in effect, agricultural families didn't need insurance policies by having as many children as they could. But you're absolutely right that now we're seeing a significant decline in key countries where we've seen a corresponding increase in economic prerogatives, so that we're seeing fewer and fewer children. From my point of view, to take your good point one step further, is that girls now are the brass ring in terms of defining carrying capacity of the planet and a range of the other dislocations that I talked about. Because if we can get girls to a point where they can effectively choose how they lead their reproductive lives, that could alleviate a lot of the pressures that I sought to highlight for you tonight.
Well, once again, thank you for this lovely talk, even though it may not be the most encouraging. But I wonder, have you seen any data or studies emerging on climate migration in the United States? And related, what role do you see hazard insurance and the reinsurance market impacting the economics within the U.S.?
Taking your points in inverse order. The insurance companies obviously have a huge position on the outcome, in particular on extreme weather. We've seen that here in the US already. And this has been all over their screens for years and years. They've issued multiple reports that I think are very credible and compelling, suggesting that unless and until we can begin to try to align on alleviating some of these pressures, it's going to be more and more difficult for us to ensure key areas I think this is really self-evident. If we have one area of this country or of the world that gets bombarded, that gets battered regularly, and we see the extreme weather not intensifying rather than diminishing, it seems to me that we ought to be rethinking the model. On climate migration, I'm not sure about the data, frankly. And the UN has tried to do a little work now, and it's pretty hard to dissect. For those of us who, and I'm sure it's everyone in this room who have been watching the reporting about what's happening on our southern border right now, it's hard to tell about what the difference or the percentage of human rights versus economic hardship versus other issues may be for those individuals trying to gain entry into the country. And I haven't seen any kind of methodologies that I think are really very persuasive on that yet. But I do think that there are a number of people now beginning to do work in this area in the academic space.
I was really wondering within the United States.
Yeah. I haven't, including within the United States. Yep. Thank you.
My question is, Dr. Downer, I was curious about innovation. You presented with us all of the future challenges we have, but didn't mention any of the innovation that we've enjoyed since 2000, whether it's artificial intelligence, the semiconductor revolution, the green production revolution, and all of these things that, while have not solved everything, have changed many curves that many demographers and others had forecasted 10, 20, and 40 years ago. Is there any room for any kind of innovation from small nuclear to water technology? And I could go on and on and on. There's got to be some room for some amount of innovation and its impact.
Huge amount of room. So I'm going to go Jekyll, Hyde Jekyll now. You're absolutely right. And if we look at what we call probably the five advanced or fifth generation technologies, they really have reshaped our environment. You mentioned artificial intelligence. 3D printing has had and is having a very significant impact. The whole issue of computational capabilities now, moving into quantum, for example, is quite remarkable. As we think about AR, VR, and that whole area, we're just at the beginning of that whole process. And then to that, I would add nano and bio. Nano, there are a number of new material science innovations coming out now. And bio, I've had the opportunity to meet Jennifer Doudna, who got the Nobel Prize for CRISPR. And I think that that's kind of emblematic of a remarkable shift right now that's going on in terms of animal and human health and agricultural issues. All of that, I think, could be transformed. I tried to emphasize in the connection with resources that some of the breakthroughs happening, in particular in water and agriculture, are significant, but you raised a very important one. The new news now on fusion, for example, could really be a game changer. And then the one that I'm waiting for innovation right now is batteries. As we see this electrification of broader segments of society, that is really exciting that we're beginning to see new developments there. And then there are continued advances in renewable space on energy too that we could talk about if you'd like. So your point is very valid.
To tag on to that question, you showed us a slide about how government is failing as it relates to where do we go in the future. Who do we turn to now to think about these things strategically? I'd love to know, we didn't really talk about the positive side of where we could go, but you did mention that business needs to lead it. It is leading it. They're trying. But unfortunately, sometimes the incentives are not aligned at all.
That's
so
right.
help us understand where the hope is.
Yeah. Well, so the kumbaya response to that is strategic alliances, involving different groups of organizations. But the record is mixed on that. But I think that now there are a lot of people who are very committed to making a dent in these challenges and to moving forward on the opportunities. And coming back to the whole innovation issue, I think there's possibility that we could get things rolling there. The former, so no work relationship here, but the former CEO of a very large consumer products group in Europe has created a group called Imagine! Where they're beginning to look for kind of concrete, deliberate ways to mobilize different groups across society. And I really think that's kind of the way to go. And then I also think, at least my world is turned upside down day by this whole ESG debate right now. And I have to tell you how extraordinary I think the transition, at least the declaratory transition to ESG has been across a whole number of organizations. So I'm hopeful that we can begin to see more kind of organizational cohesion and we can avoid the kakistocracies in the future.